The search for the true shape of our evolutionary tree has long been a story of fragments and puzzles, each fossil adding a sliver of insight, yet complicating the whole. For years, Denisovans were a ghost lineage, known almost entirely from genetic traces, and a handful of bones too fragmentary to sketch a face from. Homo floresiensis, the hobbit of Flores, seemed at first so alien that it was dismissed as pathological, a disease deviation rather than a people in their own right. The discovery of Homo floresiensis reshaped the way we think about the human family tree. For decades, the dominant view was that Homo erectus arose in Africa around 2 million years ago, and then spread eastward into Eurasia. Yet the Flores hobbits complicate that story. If these small-bodied people descend from an early population of Asian Homo erectus that retained more primitive features, then perhaps the very origins of Homo erectus were not African. Instead, it is possible that Asia was the true cradle of erectus, with some groups later migrating back into Africa. This scenario has been discussed for decades, but pushed aside in favor of a simplistic one-way model. The oldest fossils attributed to Homo erectus in Asia are remarkably ancient. At Dmanisi in Georgia, fossils dated to 1.8 million years ago combine erectus-like skull shapes with primitive jaws and small brains and fragile bodies closer to Homo habilis. In China, Yuanmu teeth and gong-wangling skull fragments, both more than 1.6 million years old, hint at equally early occupations. Java has its own famous record, with Sangiran fossils showing up by at least 1.5 million years ago. These discoveries together show that Asia was inhabited by a diverse set of archaic humans extremely early in prehistory. When compared with African finds, it raises a puzzle. Who came first? Traditionally, African fossils, such as those at Kubifora and West Turkana, have been seen as the prototype of Homo erectus, sometimes classified as Homo ergaster. Yet the oldest well-defined African erectus fossils are not much older than 1.6 to 1.7 million years. That means the Asian record is nearly as old, if not older. This chronological overlap leaves open the possibility that erectus first emerged in Asia from an earlier migrant population, before some groups returned westward into Africa. Flores makes this argument more compelling. The hobbits preserve a suite of anatomical traits that look even more primitive than African erectus. Their wrists, shoulders and feet resemble forms known from Australopithecus and Homo habilis, while their brains are far smaller than any standard erectus. If they branched from an early Asian lineage, it implies that archaic humans who left Africa were already highly variable. Some evolved into robust erectus in Java, while others retained older features and on an isolated island like Flores developed into a unique species. This mosaic of traits may reflect an Asian evolutionary center rather than a simple dispersal from Africa. If Homo erectus did originate in Asia, then Africa's record might represent a later reintroduction. Populations could have spread back into Africa around 1.6 million years ago, where they thrived and eventually gave rise to successors such as Homo heidelbergensis and, ultimately, modern humans. Such a back-migration model would explain why Asian erectus fossils are so early, why Flores hobbits preserve primitive anatomy, and why the African fossil record for erectus is not decisively older. The prevailing consensus still favors an African origin, yet the evidence from Flores, Java and China invites us to consider a different narrative, that Asia was not a passive recipient of human dispersals, but a crucible of our genus. In that light, the hobbits are not a side branch, but a vital clue suggesting that the roots of Homo erectus may lie in Asia, with Africa only one destination in a much wider story of movement and return. The Narmada skull of India, on the other hand, was so modern that it seemed to embody the opposite extreme, a cranium that some argued must be early Homo sapiens, others insisted was a late version of Homo erectus, and still others placed in the ambiguous bucket of Homo heidelbergensis. For decades, these three stories ran in parallel, one about a mysterious ghost, one about a tiny hobbit, one about an enigmatic skull from the Indian subcontinent. A newly published study now invites us to consider them together. For when their findings and narratives are interlaced, a new picture emerges of Denisovan identity, the dwarfing of Homo erectus, and the place of Narmada as a link between them. The study approached the Denisovan problem from a new angle. Instead of waiting for rare DNA extractions to succeed in poorly preserved fossils, they built what they called a gene regulatory phenotype profile. They asked what the Denisovan genome, as reconstructed from ancient DNA, tells us about how their cranial morphology should have looked. By tracking methylation patterns and connecting them to known phenotypic outcomes, they produced a predicted cranial shape, a set of 18 features expected to differ from Neanderthals or modern humans. With this in hand, they scanned the Middle Pleistocene fossil record, measuring crania where DNA had failed, and comparing them to the Denisovan profile. Out of more than 60 specimens, 3 emerged as striking matches, all massive: Harbin, Dali and Kabwe. Harbin has since been confirmed by genetic work to be Denisovan, validating the method. Dali, with 15 of 18 traits in alignment, stood out as a near twin to Harbin. Kabwe, though far away in Zambia, showed a remarkable affinity to the Neanderthal Denisovan clade, close to its root, and perhaps representing a population near the very split that gave rise to these sister lineages. The Petrolona skull in Greece also clustered with these high scorers, suggesting Europe too may have held populations with Denisovan-like traits. For the first time, Denisovans had a face, and it was one that looked out not only from Siberia and Tibet, but from China, Africa, and perhaps Europe. This genetic phenotyping does more than give Denisovans shape. It places them firmly in the swirling variability of the Middle Pleistocene, an era sometimes called the muddle in the middle because of how many fossils resist neat classification. Here, the Kabwe skull, also known as the Broken Hill skull, robust and archaic, yet with a cranial capacity nearing modern ranges, begins to make sense. Here too, the Petrolona cranium, long argued over, can be seen not as a lone outlier, but as part of a broad family of forms overlapping with the Denisovan branch. A Denisovan-like human in Europe is not so far-fetched. A Denisovan-like mitochondrial DNA was found in the Cima de los Huesos specimens in Spain, dated to 430,000 years ago. However, the presence of a Denisovan mitochondrial DNA only means that individual had a Denisovan female ancestor on their maternal family tree, but doesn't mean they were primarily of Denisovan ancestry. The work suggests that Denisovans were not an isolated Eastern experiment, but part of a greater web of populations stretching across continents. It is against this background of Denisovan morphology that the hobbit and the Narmada skull must be re-examined.
Suddenly, we have found a small-brained hominid that's primitive, that's not a human, not anything like one of those large-brained hominids.
Homo floresiensis, discovered in Liangbua Cave on Flores Island, was at first too strange to be believed. Barely more than a metre tall, with a brain the size of a chimpanzee's, yet found with stone tools and butchered bones of pygmy elephants, the hobbits confounded categories. For years the debate raged. Were they diseased modern humans, perhaps microcephalic dwarves, or the last holdouts of a primitive species like Homo habilis? The answer, after decades of work, has crystallized. Fossils from Matamenga on Flores, dating back more than 700,000 years, reveal that dwarfing occurred deep in their lineage. An adult humerus from this site is smaller than any known adult hominin bone, and the teeth, though tiny, bear the unmistakable stamp of Javanese Homo erectus ancestry. The hobbits were not diseased, they were dwarfed Homo erectus, stranded on an island and sculpted by evolution into a permanent population of little people. Their small size was no handicap. They hunted stegodon elephants, butchered them with sharp flakes, roasted their meat, and thrived for hundreds of millennia until about 60,000 years ago. The Narmada skull, by contrast, is a monument of robustness. Discovered in India, its thick cranial walls, large brow ridges, and brain size within modern human ranges made it the subject of endless classification debates. Was it late erectus, early sapiens, or something in between? Recent phylogenetic analyses now place it as a close relative of Homo floresiensis, part of a sister clade that diverged from Asian erectus. In this picture, the hobbits and Narmada represent two extremes of adaptation springing from the same root. Flores, an island of limited resources and peculiar fauna, selected for small bodies and small brains. India, with its expansive plains and abundant prey, favoured retaining and even increasing body and brain size. Both lineages came from the stock of Homo erectus that had spread across Asia, but their fates could not have been more different. The hobbit shows that tiny size and reduced brains did not prevent sophisticated survival strategies. Narmada shows that large brains and robust frames could also emerge outside the direct line to modern humans. Together they highlight the evolutionary flexibility of erectus descendants. When Denisovan findings are linked to the story of Flores and Narmada, the pattern sharpens. Harbin and Dali in China, strong Denisovan candidates, sit geographically between the Indonesian hobbits and the Indian Narmada skull. All are part of the same Asian theatre of evolution. Kabwe, though in Africa, shows an affinity to the root of the Neanderthal-Denisovan split, suggesting that lineages carrying Denisovan-like traits were not restricted to the east. Petrolona in Europe also shares in this morphological cluster. Asia, far from being a peripheral stage, emerges as the centre of diversity, hosting robust hominins, dwarfed islanders, and Denisovan cousins who would later leave their DNA across the continent and into Oceania. It is in Asia that Homo erectus became a shapeshifter, producing Floresiensis, Narmada, Harbin, and Dali. It is in Asia that Denisovans thrived, diversified, and interbred with modern humans, leaving genetic legacies in Tibetans and Papuans. And it is in Asia that we see the clearest examples of how geography and ecology could sculpt wildly different human forms from the same ancestral stock. The link between Narmada, Floresiensis, and Denisovans is not one of direct descent, but of shared ancestry and parallel adaptation. Narmada and Flores form sister clades from Asian erectus, branching off in different directions. Denisovans too branch from this Asian stock, their features predicted by genetic profiles and matched in Harbin and Dali. All three represent the outcomes of a species that had left Africa nearly 2 million years ago and spread across continents, adapting to every environment it encountered. The dwarfing of Flores, the robustness of Narmada, and the Denisovan cranial patterns are not contradictions, but complementary pieces of the same story, that Homo erectus and its descendants were the great experimenters of the Pleistocene. What unites them is adaptability. The hobbits crossed deep straits to reach Flores, surviving on an island never connected to the mainland. Narmada's people thrived in the Indian subcontinent, perhaps interacting with other archaic lineages and weathering climatic swings. Denisovans spread from Siberia to Tibet, Papua and China, interbreeding with our ancestors and leaving a genetic signature still detectable today. Their physical forms differed dramatically, small, large, robust, archaic, but they all succeeded for hundreds of thousands of years. Survival was the common denominator, not body size, not brain volume, not neat categories of species. The new study is significant because it gives Denisovans a face where before there was only a genome. It shows that even without DNA, morphology can be matched to genetic predictions with high precision. It demonstrates that the massive Kabwe skull, far away in Africa, may belong in the story of Denisovan ancestry. When tied to the story of Flores and Narmada, it shows that the Denisovan world was not limited to caves in Siberia, but stretched across the continent. Flores did not become Denisovans, but they illuminate the broader landscape in which Denisovans lived, a landscape of extremes and of unexpected outcomes. In this light, Homo floresiensis ceases to be a bizarre oddity, the hobbit out of place, and instead becomes a natural outcome of the same forces that produced Denisovans and Narmada. All three were products of Homo erectus's expansion. All three adapted in extraordinary ways. All three complicate and enrich our picture of what it means to be human. The hobbit's tiny bones, the Narmada skull's large dome, and the Denisovan traits of Harbin and Dali are pages from the same chapter, one in which Asia was the crucible of human diversity. Evolution here was not a ladder, but a branching bush, a tangled web where giants, dwarfs, and ghost lineages all found room to survive. This synthesis tells us something profound about ourselves. The story of humanity is not about a single line climbing toward modernity, but about many lines, many experiments, most of which ended but all of which mattered. Denisovans remind us that genetics can preserve the memory of lost peoples. Hobbits remind us that small bodies and small brains can still craft tools and hunt elephants. Narmada reminds us that robustness and brain expansion were not the exclusive property of Homo sapiens. Together, they remind us that adaptability is the true hallmark of our genus. To understand humanity is to embrace this diversity, to see in the hobbit, in Narmada, and in the Denisovan skulls not aberrations but kin. The study on candidate Denisovan fossils and the narrative of Homo floresiensis as a dwarfed Homo erectus sister to the robust Narmada skull together create a powerful window into the tangled history of human evolution across the Old World. When studied alongside one another, these accounts highlight the extremes of adaptability, the branching of lineages, and the unexpected ways ecological pressures sculpted the human form. The story of Homo floresiensis and Homo erectus illustrates the wild plasticity of human evolution in Asia. Floresiensis, the hobbit of Indonesia, was once dismissed as diseased modern humans, but is now convincingly established as a dwarfed Homo erectus lineage. Fossils from Matamenga show that dwarfing was already well advanced more than 700,000 years ago, with humeri and teeth smaller than any other adult hominin known. These hobbits thrived for hundreds of thousands of years on their island. The Narmada skull of India, by contrast, was large and robust, with a cranial capacity approaching that of modern humans. Phylogenetic analyses now place Flores and Narmada together as sister clades that diverged from Asian erectus, one taking the path of extreme dwarfing under island pressure, the other retaining or even enhancing body and brain size on the continental plains. Taken together, these fossils underscore that human evolution in the middle. Pleistocene was not a straight march from erectus to sapiens, but a bushy and experimental process. Populations diverged, shrank, expanded, and adapted in wildly different ways. Denisovans may have included both the massive skulls of Harbin and Kabwe. The sister clades of Narmada and Flores demonstrate that size was no predictor of success, for both endured for hundreds of millennia in their respective environments. And the presence of Petrolona, clustering with these Denisovan-like crania, raises the possibility that the boundaries of the Denisovan world stretched even further than genetics alone has revealed. Denisovans, hobbits, and the people of Narmada all found ways to endure in their environments. Some crossed rivers and seas, some shrank to childlike stature, others grew large and powerful. Some vanished without descendants, others left their DNA in millions of us today. By bringing these disparate threads together, we glimpse the extraordinary flexibility of the human lineage, a lineage that could produce Kabwe, Harbin, Dali, Petrolona, Flores, and Narmada, all at once, all human, all experiments in what it means to adapt. Thank you for watching and pondering our origins together.